Hello, everybody, and welcome to Social Cognition number 6, this time on automaticity. And first of all, let's again take a look at what it is that we're going to do in this lecture. We are going to talk about how automaticity plays a role in perception and social judgment. And we will speak about a couple of perspectives. One of them is the perceiving as for doing perspective. The next one is that we will talk about the social role of automaticity. And in particular, we'll talk about how non-conscious behavioral mimicry takes place, how sometimes we conform to norms without even really thinking it through deliberately. And we will also speak about negative social associations. And then we'll move on to speak about more complex forms of automatic behavior. And in particular, we'll talk about some cultural dimensions of individualism and collectivism. And we'll also speak about priming roles and priming goals. So that'll be our target for this lecture. And let's jump right in. Okay, as a little starter for our lecture, I'd like you to take a look at these. So first of all, in this line of handwritten text, what do you read? You probably read 12, 13, 14, right? But in this little line, what do you read? A, B, C, right? So my point here is that the things that we see or the things that we perceive, they depend a lot on the context of what else we're experiencing. So whether you see the second digit or letter here as a 13 or as a B, it's the same letter, right? But depending on what's around it, it appears differently to us. And of course, we could now also begin speaking about visual illusions again, and about how sometimes just the way that things are embedded. For instance, here in this Ebbinghaus illusion, where the relative size perception changes of the inner circle depending on the size of the outer circles. Basically, what you could say is no matter how hard we try, just sometimes our system seems to make, well, I'm not sure if to call them errors, but our system seems to make judgments that we can't override. Even if you try really hard to see these two inner circles and to focus on them and make sure to see that they're the same size, well, just by looking at them like this, it's really going to be very hard for you to do. So my point being here that it seems like there are things that our brain does, brain as our standing in for our cognition generally, or our system. There seem to be things that our system does that we aren't really in control over. And this is something that I would like to give you a moment to think about and reflect about, and maybe formulate some thoughts about what do you think, to what degree we are in control over our own behavior in our cognitions. So take a moment to pause and think about situations where you feel you have a lot of control over your behavior and your cognitions, and situations where you feel that is not the case, that you have a lot of control. So what makes them different, and what do you think in the end? Are we mostly in control? Are we mostly not in control? Take a moment to think about this. So now that you've thought about this for a little bit, we could talk about this, right? If we were now in a regular class, we would have a discussion about this. Instead, I'm going to tell you what I think, which is that I think that the dimension of control, I think it's not split. So it's not that we are in total control or we have zero control, but I think we usually in our everyday interactions, we are somewhere on a continuum of being in some kind of control. And there are situations where we try to focus really hard, and we try to elaborate our thinking, and we try to keep in very good control over our behavior. And then we are more on the controlled side of things. But there are also cases where that's just not how we operate, where we rely on maybe even instincts, but definitely intuitions And there are also situations where our brain can kind of play tricks on us, like the visual illusions. So I would say that the way our system operates is on a continuum between controlled and not controlled. And we have some control over putting ourselves into the more deliberate way, but that's not all there is. That would be my take on it. But of course, if that is our perspective on we are on the degree to which we are in control over our own behavior, well, we can ask some really critical questions. For instance, do brains commit crimes? And this is another one that I'd like to ask you to pause this video for and think a bit about this yourself. Maybe also go ahead and Google around a little bit, try to find some information about discussions on the internet, and think about whether you think that actually when people commit crimes, largely, are they responsible, or is their brain responsible for it? Take a moment to pause, and then let's come back here and talk more about it. So, do brains commit crimes? Well, this is a tough question, right? Because our entire legal system revolves around the idea that indeed we are in charge of our behavior, and if we misbehave, then we need to be punished and kept from doing it again. So there is the assumption, at least to some degree, that we are in charge of our behavior, and therefore we can be punished for it. We can be held responsible for it. But there are some notable exceptions that many legal systems will consider when asking the question whether people are in charge of their behavior. And one of these circumstances where people would say, or legal systems would accept that someone wasn't entirely in charge of their behavior, for instance, is when they're drunk or inebriated or under the influence of some other drug. So to the extent where we would commonly believe that this means that you are no longer in charge of your own behavior. Another situation that would sometimes allow some lenience would be psychological disorders, to a degree where people cannot differentiate between their intention and control behavior, and their perhaps unfortunate, how should I put it, unfortunate inclination to misbehavior. So these would be cases where some legal systems, or many legal systems actually, would cut people some slack and say, okay, well, maybe in this case you actually weren't in control over your behavior. But largely, legal systems would make sort of the assumption that you know what you're doing, or at least you would be able to stop yourself from doing it. And if you do not, therefore you should be held responsible. So now that you've made some of your own thoughts about whether or not we are in control and to what degree, we can consult the literature a little bit about this, right? So we can look at what theories in psychology say about the degree to which we are in control over our own behaviors and cognitions. And one perspective on this is the no control argument. It's saying that, well, we have basically no control over what's going on. One part of this is the Freudian perspective that emphasizes that there's a strong role in our in determining our behavior and our cognitions by the id, so by our unconscious desires and drives and needs, and also biological factors, and that this no control, or this id, this inner driving force, can potentially be made visible, for instance, through, let's say, associations or other Freudian interventions, basically, so that we can manage to tap into these unconscious desires, but also they can occasionally be superseded by conscious thought, so by our Über-Ich or by our ego. They can be superseded by conscious thought, but only under the right circumstances. So it takes the right situation for ego to win over it. That would be the Freudian perspective, saying largely, not so much control. We can also consider the behaviorist perspective that would, surprisingly, make a similar conclusion, but arrive at this conclusion in a very different fashion. So some radical behaviorism would probably say that external factors determine behavior in a stimulus response fashion. And it is not entirely clear if the cognitions that happen in between, in the so-called black box, if these cognitions are even the driving force of behaviors, or if they might just be post hoc rationalizations. So that the behaviorist perspective would say, well, the extreme one would say, well, let's discard the idea that people have control over their behavior and rather assume that it is mostly external stimuli that drive how people think and what they do. So those are two lines of thought, lines of reasoning that would run into the no control argument. But there's also the other side, right? There's also the full control argument. So the full control argument, for instance, coming from the humanist perspective. Here, the idea is strong that there is a causal self, and that this causal self determines behavior through cognitions. There's some early theories that even would suggest that there is a tiny homunculus in our brain that's kind of in executive control over our behaviors. Basically the idea is that inside of us rests something that is in charge. Okay, so these perspectives, they seem to be pretty much at odds, right? One says largely in charge, the other one says largely not in charge. So is there a way through the middle? Yes, we could take the dual process theory as a way through the middle. So the idea that both things happen. Sometimes we are in a mode of thinking that is very controlled, where we are very intentional about what's going on. We are aware of everything, but this is an effortful process, and it leads to deliberate behavior. And on the other side, in this dual process model, we would consider automatic behavior, meaning behavior that is not effortful, where potentially we're unaware, but it may still be, and potentially also stuff happens that's not intentional, right? So automatic behavior would be kind of the other side of the other system in this idea. And often these dual process theories kind of have a dichotomous approach to it. They say, oh, either you're in this processing mode or you're in that processing mode. What I said earlier about the continuum thing is kind of taking that idea a bit further and saying, well, it's probably not the case that we're only in this mode or only in that mode, but whether we are more or less in this or that mode or somewhere in the middle. Right. So this is therefore the idea of dual process theory, and we've talked about deliberate behavior a great deal already, and now it's time to jump into automatic behavior in more detail. In order to do that, first though, we have to do some definitions. So what defines automatic behavior? We would say that there are basically two types. One type of behavior would be automatic behavior that is intentional but effortless. So, for example, if you want to walk to Albert Heijn to get yourself something for lunch, you would do that with intention because you're going there because you want to get yourself something for lunch, but you wouldn't continuously supervise every single step that you take to get there. So, leaving your house, walking over there, and then getting to the Albert Heijn, this process, you don't take a lot of effort to mentally place your foot on the sidewalk and then every single step. No, you don't do that, but you just walk. And therefore we would consider this type of behavior automatic. Intentional, because you want to get somewhere, but effortless. So this is the first type of automatic behavior. And then there's a second one, where you are unaware of what's going on, but it's still effortless. So an example here would be confirmation bias. Without intention, and without continuously supervising every single step, we look for information that confirms our previously held beliefs. So now that I've done some definition work for you, time for you to apply it and take a moment to think about examples for both categories of automatic behavior. Pause the video here and then come back to hear some examples from me. Okay. So you've thought about examples. Let me give some more. For intentional but effortless behavior, I would give the example of driving or swimming or typing, where we don't control every single muscle movement, every single step we take, but there's an intention to it. Like maybe if I'm writing someone a text message, I do this with intention. I want to write that text message. But I don't, it's become such an effortless behavior to me that my thumbs will just do the typing pretty much without me having to supervise every single step. So this would be examples for intentional but effortless. Oh, for my Dutch students out there, cycling is definitely also one that fits in this category. And for the unaware and effortless type of behavior, I would say just any type of bias fits in this category. Okay. And because you might have realized that automaticity actually plays such a huge role, here are some areas where it does play a role. So it plays a role in perception, in social judgment and control, and also in social behavior. In order to be able to discuss how exactly automaticity plays a role in these types of behaviors and cognitions, we have to acknowledge, first of all, still the role of priming. So without priming, we can't discuss automaticity here. And therefore, well, let's ask Wikipedia, what is a prime? Or priming, and it would tell you that priming is a technique where the exposure to one stimulus influences a response to a subsequent stimulus without conscious guidance or intention. So this means that in the many experiments that we will discuss in this lecture, the prime is the one stimulus that is shown to participants, and then being exposed to this stimulus spills over into subsequent behavior and cognitions without participants realizing that this is the case. Yeah? So the idea is that here we trigger someone's behavior with a stimulus, with a prime, that leads to changes in subsequent behavior regarding another object, without reaching participants' cognitive realizations.